Welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast, exploring the inner reaches of the heart and mind, brought to you by Rangsheng Yeshe Gomde, Germany-Austria, and your host, Erric Solomon.
Welcome to another episode of the Kind Heartfulness podcast, and today we're going to talk about compassion. You know, compassion is the basis of a great body of Buddhist practice. You can say it's the foundation. But what is compassion? How do we know we have it? Is compassion something that you go around the world and gather, or is it something about how you manifest in your life? Is it a way of viewing the world? Well, today we're going to talk to one of the great experts on teaching compassion, Dr. Erika Rosenberg, and we're going to discuss about how compassion can improve really every aspect of our life. And not only that, but Erika is going to, I've asked her to give us some practical advice about how to bring more compassion into our lives. This is something I think in today's world is absolutely essential. It's a revolution of the mind, of the heart, and it can affect our world. So Dr. Erika Rosenberg is a scientist, author, and educator who seeks to help people understand themselves and one another better, connect with one another, and find peace and joy in life and suffer less. Erika is a co-creator of the Compassion Cultivation Training program at Stanford University, founding faculty at the Compassion Institute and the faculty at the Nyingma Institute in Berkeley. Erika has taught all kinds of places, such as Google, Lerab Ling Monastery, LucasFilm, Upaya Zen Center, Esalen Institute, and even Burning Man. She volunteers in psychedelic harm reduction and psychedelic integration through such programs as the Zendo Project and the Psychedelic Sangha in New York City. Dr. Rosenberg's work focuses on the study of emotion, emotion expression, and contemplative science, and at the Center for Mind and Brain at UC Davis, Erika Rosenberg is a member of the Saron Lab, which conducts multidisciplinary, path-breaking research in contemplative science. So she's also a published author, and including What the Face Reveals with Paul Ekman. It's now in its third edition, and a widely used introductory psychology test, Psychology, Perspectives and Connection, which is now in its sixth edition. And so I'd like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Erika Rosenberg to our podcast. Dr. Erika Rosenberg, welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to get this opportunity to sit down with you.
And we're going to talk about compassion and how compassion is good for everything. So I'm going to ask you, what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is, and I gave you a slightly different phrase for that. I said compassion can help with everything. And so in that sense, it's good, or it's beneficial for everything. Yes. Well, it sounds like a really bold statement, but it's actually, in my lived experience, in what I've seen from years of teaching compassion, as whether in a traditional Tibetan Buddhist setting or in a secular academic setting, and just my coming on 60 years on planet Earth, dealing with human beings, when I tap into my own compassionate nature and am able to reside there, it can make being in this world with all the challenges just easier, because one of the things about compassion, and if you think about what compassion is, you are, I will talk about this in relation to another person, but it's important to understand that is inclusive of you. One of the things that comes up when we talk about compassion, it sounds traditionally very other focused, but it's all of us focused, right? And so, and it's funny, Westerners always want to kind of specify that, but my sense is that, especially in the original sense, of course it includes you, right? But yes. We have to make,
I've never heard any single Buddhist prayer say, for the benefit of all beings except oneself.
Right. But somehow the Western mind comes for that, and we're saying others, but what about me? Yeah. Because, I've been so deprived, and I'm supposed, anyway.
Yeah.
That is such a discussion, right? The self-compassion deficits in
Yes.
the Western world, but we'll just leave that aside for a second. And I don't want to use West as a gloss for everything. I'm speaking primarily as an American. At any rate, compassion is being moved by the condition of another or oneself or a being or all beings, and it especially suffering and being moved to relieve it and wanting others and to feel relief from that. And also kind of taps into this notion, I know what it feels like to suffer, and it's not good, and that everything would be better if we could be a little free of that. So some compassion is very motivating and accommodating, and it embraces or it subsumes in it this notion of, I see you, I see you're hurting, I know what hurt feels like, so that building a connection right there, and also wishing for the freedom for it. So that's where the may you have ease, may you be free from suffering, but there's also this added element of this is where the loving kindness element comes in, the metta, may you flourish, may you be well. So compassion embraces both the being real with difficulty and the possibility for blossoming. And so in that sense, compassion embraces opposites or holds opposites. And that is a breadth of focus that is huge. And as you're working with it, we have to be careful because we can get overwhelmed by it. But if you can reside in it and cultivate this compassion orientation to whatever arises, you are better able to accommodate just about anything that life throws your way. That doesn't mean you're going to be okay when something horrifying happens, but I said better able to accommodate, right?
I think
so
you're
it
talking
helps
about resilience then, right?
I think resilience is part of it. It's interesting when you think about how do you define resilience. So it's being able to spring back, so we use the word resilience borrowing from physics as kind of bounciness, right? So that you spring back from challenge, and that's part of it. But I also like to think of this term that we use a lot in meditation teaching, and that's spaciousness, right? So we can think of, we got all the metaphors, right? You're a big, the bigger vessel. If you have a small glass and you put a tablespoon of salt in it, it's going to be super salty. But if you have a big vat and you put the same amount of salt in it, the water's not going to be as salty. So it's sort of like you can hold more, you can move through more. And also because that, let's take the spaciousness metaphor a little bit, because that vessel's bigger, there's room to see how to walk through, how to move through what's going on. That you can say, okay, there's something very difficult, and feel how you feel and be with it, and then keep going, or make whatever behavioral choice needs to be made at the time, and have a little clarity of vision, because you're not in the middle of all these things bouncing around and is overwhelmed. So I think you're more spacious, you're better able to deal with things, you're less hard on yourself, less hard on others, and more able to see how to act.
I think the point you're making about spaciousness to me seems to be the key. That in a way you can say Buddhist practice is actually about discovering that we are fundamentally spacious. It doesn't seem that way, right?
We're fundamentally space.
That's right. And so, but just from myself, the way I find it, often the more spacious I feel, then more compassion naturally rises. But it also works the other way. And I'm curious, how do you find it?
What do you mean the other way?
Well, the more compassion I feel, the easier it is.
Oh, right. So vice versa. Right.
Yeah.
I feel like the more compassion I feel, the bigger I feel. And you're saying the more spacious you feel, the more compact. Yeah, I think it's bidirectional. It's definitely bidirectional. That spaciousness is a quality that can be cultivated not just from compassion practice. There are a lot of meditation practices that I hate to separate them in ways, because I feel like compassion is also just an orientation, a softness versus a hardness. But I feel like, especially working with compassion directly and abiding in that space and feeling, compassion is one of those things that can be an orientation, an attitude, a value. And it's also a feeling. There's a feeling element, and this may be, gosh, I'm going to defer that for a second because that's a whole other conversation.
But I hope we can go there.
Yeah, we can, but I don't want to miss my point. But so it's sort of like a compassion practice can help you feel more compassionate, and that's going to make you feel bigger. But just having a compassion orientation towards life is kind of a spacious, infinitely spacious mindset and body set. That whole organism that you are. I even, mind and body are inadequate words when we're talking about internal space and how it feels on the inside. But I think it's also because you can be more relaxed, and physiologically, there is evidence that cultivating compassion, especially self-compassion under stressful situations, can build resilience to stress and provocation, that you can come back to baseline faster. So whether that's bigness, I don't know, whether that's some other kind, it's how do you quantify spaciousness? This is the science. When you do work in contemplative science, that's your question. It's like, can we, this whole thing of even measuring compassion. I'm not so interested in measuring compassion. I'm more interested in, if you're compassionate, these things should change. These sort of emotions in these situations, because I don't know if we can directly measure compassion.
Yeah, I suspect it's more about the effect of compassion that's measured.
Right. We would predict if you're in this situation.
And the same with spaciousness too, by the way.
Right. These are like very hard concepts. But experientially, I think people understand what spaciousness means. And it's probably related to some kind of physiological quiescence. It's not being gently responsive, but in this kind of dynamic baseline. And not easily triggerable, and part of that comes from knowing your triggers.
Yes, that's a big one.
Yeah,
I think that challenge I see when people hear words like spaciousness or resilience, and especially equanimity, is they imagine some kind of blissed out, peaceful, almost states probably equivalent to something opiated, and that's kind of the opposite, I think.
So it could be further from the truth, right?
Yeah.
But it is. Thank you for bringing up like the common misconceptions. And if anything, it's eyes wide open, heart wide open.
That's heart wide open. Beautiful.
And but your eyes got to be wide open too, right? So it's like, that's why I was going back to like these components, like all those practices of stabilizing, being attentive. They are all supportive of cultivating compassion, because you have to notice suffering to be responsive to it, whether it's in yourself or in the world around you, right? You have to see that it's happening. You have to notice how it makes you feel. In fact, when we're working in the Compassion Cultivation Training Program, CCT, when we're, working on the cultivation of compassion and helping people kind of baby step into this, we spend a lot of time on helping people notice how it feels in their bodies when, for example, starting with an easy one, when a loved one is going through something difficult. What does that make you feel? And feeling that, because that's like, do I tighten? Does my belly, heart drop, what is happening bodily? Because if you can start bringing attention to those qualities when you're in sort of this privileged situation of a meditation session, you will become more familiar with those things when you're walking around in the world, and so, for example, when someone who you have the privilege of working with in the lab of meditation, like that difficult, as is typical in a lot of meditation, we talk about working with different targets, right? We start with the easy, close stuff, and we build out to that neutral person, the challenging, whatever. When we invite in a practice that person who we have challenge with. I never like to call someone the difficult person, because that makes it sound like there's no way out of that. But we have challenge with them, right? And so, how does it feel to see them? How does it feel to be with them? And usually, people will talk about like a tightening that happens. That's informative, and then you can soften that. It's safe, it's in your mind. If that's happening, then you get this skill down. You're doing this 7 days a week, right? You then in the real world start feeling anxious or something and wait, what? I'm tightening. And then you can ask yourself, is this merited? Is there a real threat here? Sometimes there is. So this isn't about being spineless in the face of real dangerous stuff, right? And then we have to educate people on that. But sometimes there's not. And most of the time there's not. And can I soften that? And instead of doing that kind of routinized habitual pattern that I have with this person, can I open, soften, and move in a different way? So it gives you, this is a great example of what Roshi Joan Halifax calls how compassion gives you strong back, soft front. Mm-hmm. It's a great metaphor because you build your courage because you're not fleeing when the difficulty's there. You can be with difficulty, but you're softening. You're not like doing this, and you're opening. And that's an incredibly powerful place, you know? So training with these things repeatedly when on the cushion can help us navigate the world more automatically in that way and work out of that defensiveness and opening and softening. Right. And I don't know if I left your original question. I was sort of got onto this whole...
You're definitely in the right ballpark. I'm just curious now then, what advice would you give to people so that they can, in the meditation session, begin to work with this stuff? How would you say? In
meditation?
Yeah.
Like what would be like a very basic practice, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm going to assume people can do the basic, get, into a meditative, calm, restful space. Okay. There's a very simple meditation for embracing shared common humanity, which is really the notion, just to define what we mean by embracing. Shared common is redundant, and there's a reason why those two words have gotten brought up in my circles, but let's say embracing common humanity. Okay. So what that means is embracing what is shared between you, and you can use this beyond humanity, but let's just stick with humanity for now. You and others, all others. Yeah, or any particular other. And this is not to, and this is why we say common or shared. This is not to assume that everybody's the same. We're not all the same. We have very different predicaments in life. We have different backgrounds, different resources, all kinds of things. So this is not to gloss over the very real differences, especially in things like privilege and resources, for different groups of people within any country or around the world. I feel like it's important to say that. But even still, even still, there is something shared. And that there is, you're both just trying to get through life. Yeah. That's, starting. So you can pick somebody in this meditation, like bring to mind, you might start with someone who's not too challenging for you, and then work up to somebody with whom you have some challenge. And maybe it's someone who's in your life, like a coworker or a colleague, where, gee, it would be better if we could get along a little bit better than we do. I mean, there might be people that you don't want to have this relationship, but you just seem to press each other's buttons or whatever it is. Most people have someone in their life that they can think of like that. And to invite them in to your mind space, imagine them in front of you, and then go through this exercise that really can be captured by these three words, just like me. And again, the word just like me the phrase doesn't mean there's no differences. Okay, we'll take that as a given. So you can say, just like me, this person's just trying to get through their day. Just like me. Just like me, they get up in the morning, they feed themselves, they take it, just like me. They probably have people in their lives who care about them, or they care about people, just like me. I don't know their story, but just like me, they probably don't want to have too much pain and would love to have a little relaxation and joy, just like me, and it's really simple. But even doing something like this for like 5 minutes a day, and I would encourage you to work with the same person, right? It might take a couple sessions to land on who's the right person to work with. Yeah. You don't want anybody who's you've had trauma with, or, anybody who's too easy, but someone who, you can bring to mind. And it's important to work with the same person because you're trying to see if you can change something there in how, and you can always, and then you can, at the end of practice, I always encourage people to bring that out to all beings, because it is a sentiment that can be applied to all beings. And you can go beyond humans. They're just trying to get through. Just all of us are just trying to get through. Yeah. And something about that, I could tell you, it seems to start whittle away at that hard shell that we can put around ourselves. And sometimes we have a hard shell because we've had really difficult experiences in life and it's been a protective mechanism, or sometimes it's something just there for specific people that we erect right away. It'll start chipping away at that. And what that does is it makes new ways of responding available. It makes the old story only one story, because there are other stories that can be woven with this other individual, and it makes it easier to progress. It builds empathic connection, So, and that's like when I'll introduce this, let's say 1 week in class, and it's part of the practice that people do. But then people are really, wherever I'm teaching meditation, I always encourage people to bring this into your daily life, right? So like you could be sitting there in a difficult situation, just tell yourself, just like me. Just like me. And I'll have people come back after a week of doing this, right? Mm-hmm. And they'll say, wow, I'm a cashier at this grocery store, and this woman came up and she was being really rude, all this stuff. And I felt myself being about to say something back to her, like, hey, you're not the only one here, or whatever. And I caught myself. And I said, I don't know, maybe she had a really bad morning. Maybe something happened that I don't know about. Maybe this isn't just about me and this interaction. Maybe she's normally not like this. And it changed, total pivot on how I engaged with her. And then the situation didn't escalate, into something horrible. Now, just the reality check on this is, the question people say is, can I change? Will it fundamentally change other people? Well, not initially, but just by not escalating. That's an effect, right? Because any situation in life with other people is a transaction between two individuals. Mm-hmm. And so there's the energy you put in, and then there's the energy that they put in, and then whatever energy, comes from that. So if you take something where it could be like, head-to-head combat, and suddenly they're still doing the head-to-head, but you're like more soft, it's more like Aikido, right? And you're kind of moving, responding to their energy.
And weaving and,
yeah. So that orientation can help a lot. And it's not something that requires, the years and years, but you have to rehearse it, you have to practice it, and, you have to remember it.
And Erika, I'd like to say something here. Because we have our listeners, I want to say this actually can change the world. If you want to know how to make the world a better place, we all should be putting our effort into learning how to do this. Because it's like, that's a virus we could spread.
That's a virus we have to spread, And, I think that really was the impetus behind this Compassion Cultivation Training program that started at Stanford in 2009. Mm-hmm. Thubten Jinpa, the primary translator for the Dalai Lama, was visiting professor in the School of Medicine at Stanford. It started in 2008, and there was a newly formed Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education that Jim Doty, a neurosurgeon, had started. And Jinpa was, working with him, and he was kind of, really, I don't know if it's accurate to say tasked by the Dalai Lama, but encouraged by the Dalai Lama, who put some of his own original money into C-Care, the center at Stanford at the time, to help support some kind of compassion training program that would be accessible to everybody. So the idea is it would be born of Tibetan Buddhist meditation plus things from Western science or whatever, not taught in a way that requires people to be a Buddhist. So, if that's what we want to call secular, that word is loaded, but widely accessible to any background and not Buddhist requiring any kind of particular worldview, so that we could help spread this stuff, just like mindfulness got spread, right? Can we spread this stuff? Now, whether we're achieving that and, all the various things where this program has left, and, Thubten Jinpa created the Compassion Institute in 2016, which is a nonprofit, which is where I teach now, but we're still teaching that. Stanford has now a whole other set of programs. Compassion has become a more popular, widely accessible tool for people, but you still have, they're still self-identified as people who want to learn this stuff. Yes. Can we, at least in, in the United States, there's been this movement for socio-emotional learning in schools that really started around the turn of the century, and it focused a lot on empathy training. And empathy training is good, but empathy is not enough.
Do you want to say why?
this is a really interesting conversation to talk about empathy versus compassion.
Yeah.
And it really partly depends on how you define empathy. We can think of empathy as both this sort of emotional resonance of feeling with, like feeling the emotion with somebody else, or feeling the feeling with somebody else. And then there's the cognitive perspective taking of, if I put myself in that situation, so you're doing a little mind experiment, I can imagine what it would be like to be going through what they're going through. They're not completely independent. They work together. You know, we can have cognitive empathy and empathic resonance. The reason why it's a necessary ingredient in compassion cultivation, I think, but it's not sufficient. Because with compassion, you're not just getting moved by it, being felt it, or understanding it. You're going a step further of really wishing that they be free of that source of difficulty. And what can I do to help? You know, and that's one of those, that last step is one of those points where some people, does compassion have to include the action, or, you know?
Yeah.
Yes. And.
Yes.
You know, the intention to go there at the very least, but the more of it, the better. You know, so empathy is sort of on the close but no cigar, necessary, very profound, very important. You know, but there are risks at the empathy stage. You can get overwhelmed by the feeling of what it's like to go through the suffering. That can also be combined with your own emotional reaction to what they're going through. And we talk about this, it's sort of like what we would talk about as a near enemy to compassion. You get overwhelmed. It's like, sometimes it's called empathic distress in the literature. And when I say the literature, this is sort of both the psychological literature on empathy and in modern compassion training circles. So you can get empathic distress. So you're like overwhelmed by the feeling of what they're going through, or personal distress, like you're so upset that your loved one has this disease that you can't get past that. So that's, you know, so it's the feeling with, it's all the good intention, it's everything. And then what are you going to do with it? And so that's the compassion is really, now that I've been so touched, now that I understand, and I don't want to be going through that because I know what it's like to feel pain. How can I help? How can I help relieve that suffering? Bring you ease. And so I think, anyway, back to the schools and making everybody have more common humanity, appreciation for common humanity. I think the empathy training is really good, but then we need to kind of like get more explicit about compassion training. And what's funny is when this stuff was starting, mindfulness training was starting to, people were trying to bring the mindfulness trainings back into schools. Around the turn of the century, I was talking to a lot of the people who were doing this work, and they were running up against the separation of church and state. And how, I know you're starting to smile for a reason. The irony here is just ridiculous. Private schools would take the programs, but public schools wouldn't take the programs. Of course, now there are mindfulness programs in a lot of public school districts in the United States. But just now, the ridiculousness of what we're dealing with is in this country, the fundamentalists trying to bring prayer back into schools. And anyway, and trying to make the point that empathy and mindfulness and compassion are not religious ideals. They might be ideals, but they're not religious concepts that are indoctrination. It's ethical behavior.
The weird thing, though, is that all the world's great religions stress compassion, understanding, empathy. All these things are key to the to progressing in whatever the religious tradition is, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's kind of a funny pushback or ironic pushback.
Well, I think that's why we can talk about ethical behavior, right? And morality, and I think things like compassion and empathy, and making an attempt to understand where someone's coming from. That's just being an ethical person, an ethical being. And it's not owned by any religion. That's why it's fundamental, I think.
That's right. And it's worth pointing out that the Dalai Lama was initially saying that these values, that when he was encouraging people like James Doty to do this research, was that this was important for any human being. It wasn't something that was just the purview of Buddhism or people practicing Buddhism, but it's just going to make everybody's life better.
Right. And
it helps with everything.
It helps with everything.
Yeah.
So, again, and I will go back to that notion of holding opposites, because life is full of all those things. It's not, we can't, anything that tries to convince you that everything can be spun to be good or pleasant, or you can't live in a world like that. That's not that's not life.
No.
Life is full of suffering all the time, and to feel that and to allow that. And if you're practicing with it, again, back to the meditation cushion, if you're doing practices where you visit that space, you see how it feels when you invite in someone, you care about, who's going through something really difficult, and you feel it, and that emotional reaction that you're having is an expression of how much you care, and that you can be with that discomfort. That's when we go back to the strong back, soft front. With compassion, you are learning how to not flee when it gets nasty. That is power.
Yeah.
That's why again, we have this like warrior training, right? We're talking about being, that whole Shambhala that, you're being with the difficulty, and you are there nonetheless. So, and you have a vision for it, not just that we have to muck around in what sucks. We have a vision for getting out of it. It's not a masochistic or sadistic at all. It's
so I'm curious.
Acknowledging reality.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, because I'm curious about how this translates. So let me formulate the question. So in Buddhism, the vision for how to get out of it, to say it in the simplest terms, it's that actualizing the full potential of human existence is possible. And it's kind of this view of what could be, that gives us this even when things are really, really challenging, there's always this possibility that I may actualize the complete potential of human existence. So how does that work then in these more secular kinds of courses that you are giving?
So how does that notion, I want to make sure I get your question.
Yeah.
So how does that notion of fully actualizing into this, infinitely compassion being, how is that manifest in a secular class?
Yeah. How do you talk about that? Or do you talk about, you kind of brought up the point. So I'm curious. We contextualize this in a very realistic way. So we have to appeal to something that makes sense to the normal, everyday, rational mind. Absolutely, sure.
And the starting point is that we inherently have a compassionate nature. And a lot of what we experience, anybody coming here, anybody showing up, young adult to old adult, whatever, is wanting to have more of it, right?
Yeah.
They're wanting to have more of it. But part of the initial work is uncovering that. Because a lot of our lived experiences, even from just into young adulthood, there's all this conditioning, these patterns of responding to things that we learn, that we're genetically destined to respond in certain ways, or we learn from our parents and our friends, or we've had very difficult experiences and we've had to cope with them, that we have defenses, we have patterns that have been usually protections against difficulty that are binding our heart. Some people talk about when some of the experiential statements I hear from people after we start really getting into this, and it takes a few weeks. It's around 3 or 4 when we start getting into self-compassion a lot, that people start talking about some kind of armor breaking open. It's really interesting to look at the metaphors that come up. And so we begin with uncovering that great, we all have that goodness inside. So that's really the starting point. You've got some goodness inside. You've got this compassionate nature. And as far as making that argument, I get into talking about like all the different, animal species, this is part of how we are evolved. We have this, right? And then can you start like even just cracking that open a little bit? But the aspiration here is more to realize that and grow it. And it can grow infinitely. So that's the being that, that aspiration for being a fully realized being, but we would never use that language. And I don't even want to put up that lofty goal, because for some people, just being able to be nicer to their, some relative who they see all the time is a revelation, right? So but we do present it as a boundless, as a Brahma Vihara, I talk about that. I talk about how it's a boundless quality. You can't have too much. It never runs out.
Immeasurable. Yeah.
It's immeasurable. Yeah. It's boundless. It's immeasurable. And immeasurable both means you can't measure it, as I was making the point.
Yes.
And it means it's so big you can't, it has this capacity to grow and grow and grow and grow. So that we're helping them set themselves on a journey to grow this capacity infinitely. Yeah, and we usually start with recognizing that you have it, starting to rehearse it. Like the first meditations that we do use in CCT are actually turning the convention a little on its head. Usually when we work with targets in meditation practice, you start with the self, then you move to a loved one, then a neutral person, etc., and you move out, like broadening the circle of compassion. But as we work this, actually Jimpa found this out after he taught the first round the more traditional way, and then invited some of us Western people with experience in both fields. I was invited in 2009 to help kind of like, along with Margaret Cohen and Philippe Golden and Kelly McGonigal, to help make this a little more accessible at that time to the Stanford students, right? And so they had trouble with the self-compassion, like a lot of people do in this American culture, at least. So we decided to start with the loved one. And the idea was, let's begin this with the easy connections. And even when we talk about loved one, pick someone where the affection arises easily. It could be your dog. It doesn't have to be a person. And just so they get used to that feeling where it naturally arises. Yes. And then the idea is you start bringing in, playing a switcheroo, then now that energy, now that's you there. Now that's you. Yeah. Now that's you. And you have pain and you have difficulty. And so that we slowly I talk about it as widening the circle of compassion as you progress outward. And I think that, then you've basically laid the groundwork for that realization. And what's interesting is, just even, this from teaching, some people like go from 0 to 60.
Yes.
Fast, but others, the increment is important.
I would say that you actually have a similar challenge even when you're teaching in a Buddhist context, which is what I often do, is that, using this word that I wish we could do away with, enlightenment. Of course, on one hand, it's nice because if we're saying anybody could be enlightened, so that part's nice. But people it's like too big, it's too much for a lot of people. Or, I tried that, and also because our culture is so much about getting gratification fast. I tried that and I didn't get enlightened. I tried to actually find other ways to talk about, like, for example, what I said earlier, the full potential of human experience, existence, sorry. And, and then, big too. Yeah, from human, the other thing too, but because I think that you can have a taste from the very beginning of a shift. And that shift that's like the camel's nose is now under the tent, right? Or you've got a foot in the door, whatever metaphor you want to use for our international audience. I've learned camel nose under the tent doesn't always work. So, you've got a foot in the door. It's already starting to happen, and building from there, and what you say is getting used to the feeling, and so many things can grow from that. I think there's some similarity even when you're teaching in.
Yeah. But the point you made about enlightenment being too difficult for people. I think realization of potential. I've always liked the metaphor of waking up.
Well, awakening in general is good. Yeah.
Waking. Yeah. And any language,
wakefulness is so nice.
Any language, any metaphor. I mean, sometimes I once had a meditation student who said, I'm going to put together a book of your metaphors for teaching meditate, because it's like metaphors are powerful, right? So we're trying to make things that are elusive or lofty, inaccessible concepts more accessible to people, and metaphor is one way of doing it. But I like waking up, opening the heart, softening, and then also the power in it. The more we cooperate, the better we get along, the better we solve problems.
Yes.
It's, for a long time, even in science, people thought that selfishness was an evolved thing because, like the whole idea of the selfish gene and ultimately self-preservation. But we now have a lot of evidence for, as evolutionarily, that cooperative problem solving was an important part of our evolutionary past. Yeah. We evolved in groups, and learning how to do things together actually makes for better outcomes in so many different contexts. Yes. So, rather than we might work on self-improvement, we might try to be better, smarter, whatever, but ultimately how we are able to engage with others is going to make a big difference in how we get through life, the amount of happiness that we have, and whether we can, save this planet or save this species, because Earth will survive.
Yes, Earth will be here.
That's why people save the planet. Like we save the planet for us. Yeah. It's sort of really what. Save it so we can live here. Save it so we can live here, because Earth will figure it out. Life goes on.
Yeah.
It's really scary to be on this precipice of the demise of the human species.
Yeah.
I don't know why I got into. I'm sorry for bringing up something really heavy.
But I think it's in one way or another on everybody's lips these days. Anyway, it just seems like the world's going faster and faster. The problems are getting more and more intense, and we're having more and more difficulty talking to one another. Families can't just celebrate holidays anymore because they start talking about anything, and people just find it's impossible to talk across ideas. I remember years ago when I was in Silicon Valley, I could go out to dinner. I had colleagues, they have politics very, very different from mine. We go out to dinner, we talk about it, everybody's laughing. Of course, we didn't totally agree, and some things we really disagreed. But what we found was our common humanity, that the issue was more about the best way to go about solving a problem rather than could we even agree that there was a problem? Nowadays, you can't even get people to agree there's a problem, right? It's really, and I think everybody's worried about it. Even the people who totally disagree with me and can't talk to me are worried about it.
Everybody's worried about it. It's because it's existential threat.
Yeah.
And it's like the pulling the rug out, and the things that we kind of grew up taking for granted, like the planet would be here.
Yeah. There'd be air to breathe.
I think especially for young people right now, if they have children, there'll be a world that they can live in. There's a reason why the population's declining. It's just, there's a lot of reasons.
I teach a lot of young people, and the amount of anger and disappointment in people your and my age is palpable. They kind of love us because, like a lot of them, parents or grandparents' age, right? Mm. But still, look at the world we're leaving, and it comes up all the time in just even in practice interviews with
Right.
people.
And then the question is, how do you get beyond the giving up, the resignation, to harness enough motivation to get people to want to do the things that'll make a difference?
Yes.
So you have the activists and you have the people who've just written it off.
Yes.
And
honestly, I think too many of the activists are acting out of anger. It's understandable. The anger is understandable.
That's not new. That's been a problem.
True.
And that's why, and this actually is an interesting topic to get to, because I think it can get around to this notion of burnout.
Yes.
And which I think is an important concept when you're talking
and
about.
Just so everyone knows, this is all compassion adjacent, and we'll come back to compassion.
Well, I was going to get right back to compassion. Good.
Thank you.
Because people talk about compassion burnout or compassion fatigue.
Yes.
And that's why I'm going to use that little thing to flip it back, but it is still related to activism. I mean, but I want to talk about this notion, because some people are attracted to these trainings because they're wiped out, overwhelmed. But then some people are also like, I can't handle, I'm a nurse or a social worker and I can't handle anymore. Compassion knocks me out. I'm compassion over like this. I'm wiped out. So there's this very popular notion of compassion fatigue or compassion burnout. And and then we have this notion of it being immeasurable, right? It'll never wear out. And I would say it'll never wear you out.
Right.
I go that far. And so what is this? But how do we,
there's people's
basically accommodate both of those? How do we, and it's sort of, here's how do we square it? And here's the deal. I think most of what people talk about as compassion fatigue is more of what I was talking about before as personal distress. And that it's like you have so much emotional overwhelm from the difficult situation or the enormity of the problem, or the fact that we're only chipping away at it, or if you're dealing in a healthcare or something, the difficulty all these people are going through, it's too much. And then you start to shut down. That's that. And that's not compassion. Compassion might be part of your motivation for being in that line of work, for wanting to help people. It might fuel you to some extent, but you've gotten derailed by how difficult the situation is. And so how do you prevent that? And actually one of the biggest, protections against compassion fatigue is to have adequately developed self-compassion. And that's one of the reasons, again, in this progression we do with CCT, Compassion Cultivation Training, we start with a loved one, we go to the self, and then before we even start taking on new targets, we then go we have like 2 weeks of the 8 around the self.
Wow.
Well, because it's compassion for the self, which is being present with your own suffering and recognizing it. And then there's loving kindness for the self, which is like, okay, I'm like, how do I envision blossoming? Maybe that's where your full flourishing, embodiment, whatever comes. So we visit that for a while. Then we go into embracing common humanity. And then you can start saying, hey, I can take care. Part of self-compassion is noticing when you're suffering, noticing what triggers you, noticing when you need attention, right? So if you've been working on that and you have that, you notice when you need sleep. You notice when you better eat lunch. You notice then, wait, no. And I know sometimes people are in work situations where they can't control their caseload or something, but it's like this. I'm just not going to be able to do it if there's one more thing to take care of. So dealing with the issues in the system that don't support people not going into burnout or fatigue, that's another issue, but there are things that you can do. So if you've got the self-care, you can notice when you're starting to go into empathic distress or personal distress and retool. I'm not saying there aren't life situations where you don't have control over that, but if you have adequate care for self in as part of that thing, you're less likely to part of that thing I want to stop you, because I think even if you don't we never have control over everything life's going to throw at us, but at least if we're aware,
wow, this is going to be really difficult because I haven't had time to eat. When I worked with, there's a hospice in Germany sometimes I was going to teach at, and I worked with the healthcare workers. And so much of what they call burnout, I think is what you're talking about, it wasn't really compassion burnout. It's that they weren't noticing the signals within them for the self-care that was necessary to function in this really, really challenging, difficult situation that they called their job. And it's true, sometimes you can't take care of yourself the way you want, but at least if you know, oh, that's what's going on right now, then what's funny is people start finding all these ways that they can make it a little more spacious, even though it's an impossible situation. And while it's not a perfect solution, it's much better than thinking, I just have compassion burnout, I can't go on, I'm just going to hide under the covers.
Right. There are two things there. I mean, more than two, but a couple things I want to respond to. Right. I mean, So you might not be able to change the whole situation. Right. Most of what we go through, we can't control the world around us, but we can control our response to it. And that's the freedom. That insight is huge. And that no matter what I'm teaching, that's like the first lesson, right? So that's true. It's also true that there might be, you have to do your job, you have to get this paycheck, you can't just not go to work today because you didn't get any sleep. So that's the shared common humanity part that acknowledges that the predicament of life is not the same for everybody. I saw this little meme the other day. It says, we're not all in the same boat, we're in the same storm. Some of us are in a yacht, some of us are in a canoe, and some of us are barely treading water. But so I really like that. So I do want to acknowledge that there's a lot of difference in terms of advantage and resources. However, there's a piece that you can control. There is a piece you can control, and that's where the freedom is. So you can, evaluate, engage with what's around you differently, and you can also take care of yourself. And so I like how you said like that. Yeah. Just even knowing that you're operating with a low tank.
Yes.
But you're operating with you don't have enough resources. Maybe you shouldn't be here. You can do what you can to make it easier on yourself. And there might just be some jobs that are horrific that way. And I know that, but there is that bit you can control, right? You can take care of yourself. You can do better. And that will actually make it easier to accommodate more and not to just shut down the process because you say, all of this is too much. There's nothing I can do about it. It sucks. Right. It gives you a sense of empowerment. It gives you a sense, it can help resolve things. And I don't think there really is compassion burnout. I think there's burnout.
Yes. Burnout's for sure.
Caused by the personal distress, is caused by this, and that, but it's not from being compassionate. Yeah. And if you've developed it well, inclusive of that is taking care of this thing, taking care of me.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I will do is I will contrast two situations, okay, where I brought compassion into my life. One is a work situation and one is the death of my father. And I actually usually teach these examples when I'm teaching Tonglen, and which Tonglen, is,
and just explain it so everybody listening.
Well, Tonglen is it's a Tibetan word that means sending and receiving or giving and taking. It's a practice for being present with the suffering of another and utilizing your compassionate nature to transform a situation, to bring more ease to it. And it's my favorite meditation practice. It's a beautiful practice, and ultimately it will build compassion. So the work situation, I've had a couple compassion related work situations. Let me talk about this one specifically because it did involve Tonglen. And I was a young professor recently, got a full-time job, and I was at an academic conference and I was sitting in the crowd. And at this point I had already been practicing meditation in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition for about 8 years. So I had some significant practice under my belt, and I was in the crowd at symposium, and up there in front in the symposium was some gentleman giving a talk who was an adversary of my advisor, who was another big man of science. And the speaker knew I was in the crowd. And in the middle of his symposium, this particular topic he was talking about basically slammed, attacked, totally took down the whole field of research that I was expert in and my mentors, because he was known as one of these adversaries. I was sitting there in the crowd with some friends there, and I was seething with anger. I was like, oh my God. And I was so defensive and I was so uncomfortable. And I knew this panel or symposium would go on for another 45 minutes and there wasn't time for me to talk yet. And I was stewing it. And all of a sudden I heard my teacher's voice in my head, practice Tonglen for him. And because I had nothing better to do. And I knew, because my area of research is emotion, that if I started bringing in visiting an emotional space that was different from what I was feeling, that would make me feel better at the very least. You know, the idea with a Tonglen practice is that you're removing, you know, literally speaking, you're kind of trying to take away some of their suffering, transform it and give them back something good. And I didn't even analyze it. I didn't even look about whether it would make a difference from him. I took faith in the fact that I know it would make me feel better. So what the hell, you know? So I did it for like 45 minutes silently. I was just doing it, and I was able to attend to what was going on. By the time the talk was over and there was time for speaking, I didn't just kind of like shirk away because I was being the sweet, compassionate Erika. No, in fact, it was the best thing I could have done, because I was no longer speaking from this raging anger with the red glasses on, if you will, you know, seeing everything threatening. In fact, I was feeling much better. I had been throwing on my, you know, kindness towards this guy, wishing that he'd be free from suffering. And I was able to stand there and bring up really good, you know, my head was clear, and I brought up all these points I disagreed with him on, and there was really good discussion. And I was so much more powerful than if I had been the defensive young lady who was pissed off in the crowd. So that was a huge transformation. That was a great gift. It ended up being such a good application of it. You know, that's one end of the spectrum. And actually, one of the things I say when I teach Tonglen practice in particular is it's a great practice to do when there's nothing you can do. So that's one situation which there was nothing I could do. But then I ended up being like Roshi Jones says, strong back, soft front. Yeah. I was kind, but I was firm about what I was saying. It didn't make me spineless in any way. Then the other end of the spectrum is my father dying of lung cancer. And I was privileged at the time to be on maternity leave, nursing a newborn. And so I could spend hours and hours at his bedside. He was fortunate to be dying at home. And I remember sitting with him with the baby, and, you know, the baby being there was this wonderful energy in the room. It would change my dad's complexion to put my baby Evan on my dad's chest. It was like probably the best healing thing there was. But I was talking to my teacher a lot at that time, and I called on her and said, what do I do? I thought maybe she'd recommend some Tibetan death practice, or to start getting, what do I start doing to his consciousness, or and she said, Tonglen, you know, just do that over and over and over with him. And it was probably one of the most exquisitely beautiful and poignant times of my life. I don't know if he knew I was doing that. It was silently just sitting there. I would do it days. It went on for about a week of doing it for hours. There was a point at which it felt like the room was breathing us. You know, it just got so big. But it made so much room in my heart for everything that was there. It kept me planted at his bedside, and it prepared me for his death. You know, and I don't know what he felt of it. I don't know. I know that he loved having me there and the baby there. But the point I try to make when I share this with my students, there didn't have to be. Maybe there was some metaphysical, mystical transfer of energy that was happening. I don't know. But what it did is it fundamentally shifted me from being so caught in the sorrow and despair of being big, of all of it, the love, the beauty, everything he's given me, his pain, may I soften it, may I make it easier. When he finally died about 8 days later, and we were all at his bedside, my mom wailing, my aunt, his sister wailing, and I was just there in this, I don't like using the word bliss. But it was almost like that because this had to happen. And I felt it was so beautiful and privileged to be there for this last moment. And also to be there for my family. And I had, it was difficult, but it was just gorgeous and awful and sad.
Yeah.
But it was just that purple space that compassion gives you, that love and the blue and the red. I feel like it stretches your heart. And I really felt like I was able to accommodate it all. And it was one of the most strengthening experiences of my life.
What a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Yeah.
And I think it really makes clear what the premise of the talk we had today, how compassion helps with everything. And I want to thank you. And I want to ask, please come back. Please.
Oh, yeah.
We have a few things in mind. So I'm saying please come back, but actually you've already agreed to come back. So I'm going to hold you to it.
And fortunately, I still agree to come back after our
fair enough.
It's been a delight talking with you. And I feel like, wait, we're done?
No, we're not done.
So we'll put a pause button on it. We'll put a pause on it. Yeah. And thank you. It's just I feel like I can't stop talking about how much compassion is beneficial.
And we're all benefiting from that.
Yeah, and if people
thank you. Please don't stop, because I really meant it earlier. I think this is the thing that can change the world, that can bring us all together at a time we really need to come together. So I encourage you, don't stop talking for all our sakes. And then one time in the not too distant future, I'll have you back here.
And we'll talk some more.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I do want to add one quick thing. That if people can think back to what I said about that just like me practice, and if that's something they can start, if you meditate, throw that in. If you don't, just even visit as a little phrase in your head. When you engage with some difficult situation with a person, remember that they're just trying to get through this thing called life. We're all not perfect, but we all want to be happy.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, we like to invite you to continue the journey into the heart of enlightened mind at gonde.eu.